I laughed at a mechanic. Then he fixed my heart. The cold seeped through my thin jacket, a biting wind that seemed to find every exposed inch of skin. I huddled deeper into myself, the sputtering cough of my car's engine a soundtrack to my mounting frustration. It had been a long day, a terrible day, filled with deadlines missed and calls ignored, and now this. Stranded on the side of a desolate highway, miles from anywhere remotely civilized, with a car that sounded like it was trying to digest rocks. My phone, predictably, had no signal. A wave of pure, unadulterated annoyance washed over me, and with it, a familiar, ugly impatience. I scanned the empty road, my gaze landing on a small, dusty garage a quarter-mile back, its sign barely visible through the gloom. A single mechanic's truck was parked outside, a beacon of hope, albeit a grimy, unappealing one. I slammed the car door shut, the sound echoing in the unnatural quiet. My mind was a whirlwind of deadlines, client demands, and the sheer inconvenience of it all. I saw the garage not as a potential savior, but as an obstacle, another delay in my already chaotic existence. The mechanic, when I finally found him, was exactly as I'd pictured him. Grease-stained overalls, calloused hands, a face etched with the weariness of long hours and thankless work. He was older, his hair thinning, his movements deliberate, almost slow. My internal monologue, already a torrent of self-pity and irritation, immediately began to paint him with broad, dismissive strokes. He was probably incompetent, I thought. Probably just another guy who knew just enough to be dangerous. I imagined him fumbling with tools, his lack of urgency mirroring my own desperation. As I approached, a harsh laugh escaped me, a brittle sound that held no humor. It was the sound of someone who felt the world was conspiring against them, and who was ready to lash out. He looked up, his eyes, a surprisingly clear blue, met mine. There was no immediate recognition of my distress, no eager rush to assist. He simply stood there, wiping his hands on a rag. My impatience flared. I gestured wildly at my car, my words tumbling out in a rush, laced with an arrogance I didn't even try to hide. I was a busy person, after all, with important things to do. This breakdown, this inconvenience, was an insult. I saw his quiet demeanor not as professionalism, but as a lack of respect. I saw his worn appearance not as a testament to hard work, but as a sign of his station. And in that moment, with the wind whipping around us and the dying light casting long shadows, I judged him. I judged him harshly, unfairly, and with a smug certainty that felt utterly justified. It was a judgment born not of malice, but of a deep-seated, unexamined privilege, a belief that my own stresses were inherently more significant, more valid than whatever silent battles he might be fighting. My laughter, I realize now, wasn't just a reaction to my own misfortune. It was a defense mechanism, a way to deflect from my own vulnerability by projecting an aura of superiority. I was so consumed by my own narrative, my own perceived victimhood, that I couldn't see the humanity in front of me. I saw a caricature, a stereotype, and I reacted accordingly with a dismissive, demeaning chuckle that echoed in the vast, empty landscape. He didn't flinch, he didn't get angry, he just nodded, a slow, almost imperceptible nod, and then, without a word, he turned and walked towards his truck. My own internal storm raged, convinced this was the beginning of a long, drawn-out ordeal. I watched him retrieve a toolbox, his movements measured, unhurried. Each click of the latch, each clink of metal against metal, seemed to amplify my own internal ticking clock. I paced, my gaze flicking between him and my stubbornly silent car, the gnawing anxiety in my gut tightening with every passing minute. The air grew colder, the darkness more absolute. I pulled my jacket tighter, the rough fabric a small comfort against the growing chill. I could feel the weight of his gaze, not accusatory, but steady, observing. It was a gaze that saw more than my frustration, more than my impatience. It saw, I would later understand, the carefully constructed walls I had built around myself. He finally spoke, his voice a low rumble, surprisingly gentle. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact, delivered with an almost weary acceptance. He asked about the car's symptoms, his questions simple, direct, devoid of the technical jargon I half expected. I rattled off the details, my voice still sharp with residual annoyance, but a flicker of something else, a nascent curiosity, began to stir. He listened, his blue eyes fixed on some distant point, as if piecing together a complex puzzle. He didn't offer false reassurances or platitudes. He simply absorbed the information, his silence more profound than any empty promise. He then walked to my car, not with the hurried efficiency I'd expected, but with a quiet competence. He opened the hood, the metal groaning in protest, and peered into the engine's depths. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the intricate, greasy labyrinth within. I stood a few feet away, arms crossed, a knot of apprehension and disbelief tightening in my chest. This was it, I thought, the moment of truth. Would he shrug his shoulders and tell me it was hopeless, or would he attempt a fix that would likely cost me a fortune and still leave me stranded? The wind howled, a mournful sound that seemed to mirror the disquiet in my soul. He worked for a long time. The only sounds were the occasional clink of a tool, the soft hiss of something I couldn't identify, and the persistent howl of the wind. I watched, my initial impatience slowly giving way to a grudging respect for his focused intensity. He moved with a deliberate grace, his large hands surprisingly deft as they navigated the cramped engine bay. There was a quiet dignity in his labor, a sense of purpose that cut through the bleakness of the night. He wasn't just fixing a car. He was engaged in a dialogue with the machine, coaxing it back to life. He emerged from beneath the hood, wiping his hands on his rag, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He didn't offer a diagnosis, no technical explanation of the ailment. Instead, he simply said, his voice barely audible above the wind, "It just needed a little coaxing. Sometimes things just need to be listened to." He then turned and walked back to his truck, leaving me standing there, the words hanging in the cold air, a riddle I didn't yet understand. Part 1. The Calling. The flickering fluorescent lights of the auto shop hummed a discordant tune, a soundtrack to the grime and oil that seemed to permeate everything. It was late, the kind of late where the world outside felt hushed and distant, and the only company I had was the acrid smell of exhaust and the persistent ache in my back. My car, a sputtering relic I'd inherited from my father, had finally given up the ghost a week ago, right outside this very establishment. "Henderson's Auto Repair," the faded sign proclaimed, a testament to decades of sweat and strained metal. I'd limped in, fully expecting the worst, a hefty bill, and a week's delay. What I found instead was a man named Silas. He was a legend in this small town, a mechanic whose hands seemed to possess a magic touch, capable of resurrecting the most stubborn engines. But Silas wasn't just known for his skill. He was also known for his quiet, almost stoic demeanor, his deep-seated aversion to small talk, and a certain gruffness that many mistook for indifference. I, in my own self-absorbed haste, certainly did. My initial interaction with Silas had been less than ideal. I'd arrived flustered, late for a crucial meeting, my voice tight with an impatience I couldn't contain. I'd seen his deliberate pace, his methodical approach to diagnosing my car's ailment, not as professionalism, but as a personal affront. "Can't you just hurry it up?" I'd blurted out, my tone sharp, laced with an unconscious assumption of my own superiority. "Some of us have actual schedules to keep." I saw the flicker of something in his eyes, not anger, but a deep, weary sadness, and I'd promptly dismissed it, doubling down on my own perceived urgency. He'd simply nodded, his gaze drifting past me, and returned to his work, the silence that followed more deafening than any reprimand. I'd felt a surge of righteous indignation, convinced he was deliberately dragging his feet, enjoying my discomfort. The world, in my eyes, was a series of inconveniences, And Silas, with his quiet competence and unhurried rhythm, was just another obstacle in my path. He'd eventually fix the car, of course. Silas always did. But the encounter had left a sour taste in my mouth, a lingering sense of unease that I couldn't quite shake. I'd driven away, my mind already racing towards my next appointment, the brief, uncomfortable interaction with the mechanic fading into the background noise of my busy life. Yet something about his quiet resignation, the depth of that fleeting sadness in his eyes, had lodged itself somewhere deep within me, a tiny, persistent splinter. It was a feeling I couldn't articulate, a question I couldn't quite formulate, but it was there, a subtle dissonance in the otherwise predictable rhythm of my days. I'd chalked it up to stress, to a bad day, to Silas's inherent gruffness. I hadn't considered, not for a single moment, that my own judgment, my own hasty pronouncements, might have been the source of the discomfort. I was too busy navigating my own world, too convinced of my own rightness to look beyond the surface. Part 2. Trials of Faith Resilience. The following weeks were a blur of frantic activity. My car, bless its resurrected engine, ran like a dream, a testament to Silas's skill. But the memory of that brief, sharp exchange nagged at me. Every time I passed Henderson's auto repair, a strange mix of guilt and defensiveness would wash over me. I'd find myself deliberately avoiding eye contact with the garage, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. It was a ridiculous reaction, I knew. He was a mechanic. I was a client. The transaction was complete. Yet the echo of my own impatience, the casual cruelty of my words, seemed to reverberate in the quiet moments. I'd always prided myself on being fair, on being decent. But that day, in the fading light, I'd been anything but. I'd seen Silas not as a person, but as a function, a tool to solve my problem. And when he hadn't met my unspoken expectations of immediate, subservient service, I'd lashed out, my own insecurities manifesting as arrogance. One rainy Tuesday, my car sputtered to a halt again, this time much closer to town, but still inconveniently far from my usual routes. The familiar dread washed over me, but this time it was tinged with a different emotion, a reluctant recognition of where I was. Henderson's. I sat there for a moment, the rhythmic drumming of rain on the windshield a stark contrast to the frantic pounding in my chest. Turning back was the easy option, the path of least resistance, but the memory of Silas's quiet sadness, the unspoken accusation in his gaze, felt heavier than the weight of my current predicament. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift, but I knew with a certainty that surprised me that I couldn't go back to my usual mechanic. I had to face Silas. I had to, at the very least, offer a proper apology. The thought was terrifying. A prospect of admitting fault that felt deeply unsettling. My pride, that old familiar companion, whispered doubts in my ear. "He probably won't even remember you," it hissed. "He'll think you're pathetic." But a deeper, quieter voice, one I'd long suppressed, urged me forward. "You owe him," it said. "You owe yourself." With a sigh that felt like it carried the weight of weeks of internal debate, I put the car in neutral and began the slow, agonizing roll towards Henderson's. The closer I got, the more my stomach churned. I imagined his reaction, his dismissive wave, his cold silence. Would he even let me in? The rain seemed to intensify, blurring the edges of the world, mirroring the disarray in my mind. I pulled up to the garage, the familiar smell of oil and metal washing over me. Silas was there, silhouetted against the harsh light of the workshop, his back to me as he tinkered with a motorcycle engine. He didn't turn as I approached, and for a moment I thought he hadn't seen me, or perhaps had chosen to ignore me. My heart sank. This was it, the confirmation of my fears. He didn't care. He didn't remember, or worse, he remembered, and he wanted nothing to do with me. I stood there, the rain plastering my hair to my forehead, the words I'd rehearsed 1,000 times, suddenly feeling hollow and inadequate. Part 3. Turning Point. He finally straightened up, his movements slow and deliberate, and turned towards me. His blue eyes, so clear and steady, met mine. There was no surprise, no flicker of recognition, just a quiet acknowledgement. He wiped his hands on a rag, the familiar gesture sending a jolt through me. This was it, the moment of truth. I opened my mouth to speak, to offer the apology I'd rehearsed, but the words caught in my throat. The sheer weight of the unspoken hung between us, heavy and suffocating. I saw him, really saw him, for the first time, not as a caricature of a gruff mechanic, but as a man. His face was lined, not with anger, but with a lifetime of quiet observation. His hands, though calloused and stained, moved with a practiced grace that spoke of deep knowledge and unwavering dedication. He wasn't just fixing cars, he was tending to a craft, a calling, and I, in my arrogant haste, had dismissed it all with a condescending laugh. He gestured towards my car, his voice a low rumble that cut through the drumming rain. "Trouble again?" he asked, and there was no judgment in his tone, only a simple, factual observation. It was a question that demanded more than a simple yes or no. It demanded an explanation, a confession, a willingness to admit my own fault. I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat making it difficult to speak. "Yes," I managed, my voice barely a whisper. I wanted to apologize. For the other day, I was out of line. I let my frustration get the better of me, and I took it out on you. That wasn't fair." The words tumbled out, raw and unvarnished, a stark contrast to the polished facade I usually presented. I braced myself for his reaction, for the dismissal, the cold shoulder. But Silas simply nodded, a slow, thoughtful nod, and then, in a gesture that surprised me more than anything, he walked towards my car, not with the hurried efficiency I'd previously expected, but with a quiet, measured pace. He opened the hood, the familiar groan of metal, a sound that now seemed less like a complaint and more like a weary sigh. He peered into the engine, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the dim, rain-streaked interior of the workshop. He didn't offer technical jargon, no complex explanations. Instead, he said, his voice soft, "Sometimes things just need a moment to breathe, to be heard." He then reached into the engine bay and gently adjusted a loose wire, a seemingly minor correction that somehow felt profoundly significant. He closed the hood with a soft click, the sound final and reassuring. He turned back to me, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. "It just needed a little attention," he said, his gaze steady. "Like most things." Part 4. The test. The engine purred to life, a smooth, contented sound that filled the small workshop. It was a sound of resurrection, of a machine brought back from the brink, and it resonated deep within me. Silas stood beside me, his presence calm and unobtrusive, a silent witness to the transformation. He didn't offer a bill, no demand for payment. He simply leaned against a workbench, his arms crossed, his blue eyes fixed on me with an expression that was neither demanding nor forgiving, but simply present. It was an invitation, I realized, an unspoken offer to bridge the gap that my own arrogance had created. The rain had softened to a drizzle, and a sliver of moon peeked through the clouds, casting a pale, ethereal glow on the scene. The air, once thick with the smell of oil and despair, now felt clean, cleansed by the rain and the unspoken acknowledgement of my own shortcomings. I looked at Silas, truly looked at him, and saw not just a mechanic, but a man who had spent his life in quiet service, his hands shaping metal and mending broken things. I saw the dignity in his labor, the profound respect he held for the intricate dance of gears and pistons. My laughter, that brittle, dismissive sound from weeks ago, echoed in my mind, a harsh counterpoint to the gentle hum of the engine. It was the sound of my own ignorance, my own blindness. I had judged him, reduced him to a stereotype, all because his life didn't fit my narrow, privileged definition of success. And in doing so, I had denied myself the opportunity to see the quiet strength, the profound empathy that lay beneath his gruff exterior. He finally spoke, his voice softer than before, almost a murmur. "Life throws a lot at us," he said, his gaze drifting towards the rain-streaked window. "Sometimes, all we can do is keep putting one foot in front of the other. And sometimes," he paused, his eyes finding mine again, "sometimes we just need someone to notice that we're trying." It wasn't a lecture, not a lesson. It was a simple observation, a shared truth. It was a moment of profound connection, forged in the shared space of a humble auto shop under the pale moonlight. Part 5, the revelation. He didn't ask for payment. He simply nodded, a gesture of quiet understanding, and stepped aside, clearing the path for my departure. I drove away, the car running smoothly, but my own internal engine was still churning, replaying the events of the evening. The silence in the car was no longer filled with my own anxieties, but with a newfound awareness. I thought about my own life, the constant rush, the endless pursuit of more, the way I often treated people as means to an end, rather than as individuals with their own stories, their own struggles. Silas, with his quiet dignity and his unexpected empathy, had held up a mirror to my own failings, not through judgment, but through simple, honest presence. As I drove, the city lights blurring into streaks of color, I felt a profound sense of release. The weight of my own self-importance, the armor of my arrogance, had begun to crack. I had entered Silas's world seeking a repair for my car, but I was leaving with something far more significant, a repair for my own fractured perspective. I realized that true strength wasn't in rushing, in demanding, in judging. It was in the quiet resilience, the unwavering dedication, the ability to see the humanity in others, even when they themselves were struggling to see it. Part 6, the aftermath. The following morning, the world felt different. The usual frantic energy that propelled me through my days seemed muted, replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. I found myself slowing down, observing, listening. I noticed the tired smile of the barista at my usual coffee shop, the weary lines around the eyes of the bus driver, the subtle interactions between people on the street. These were details I had previously overlooked, lost in the cacophony of my own internal monologue. I realized that my previous judgment of Silas hadn't just been unfair. It had been a symptom of a deeper blindness, a self-imposed isolation that prevented me from truly connecting with the world around me. I made a conscious effort to engage, to offer a word of kindness, a genuine smile. It felt awkward at first, a departure from my ingrained habits, but with each small interaction, a sense of warmth spread through me. I understood that the true fix hadn't been to my car, but to my own perception. Silas hadn't just repaired an engine, he had, in his own quiet way, begun to mend something within me. The encounter had been an unexpected detour, a disruption to my carefully planned schedule, but it had led me to a destination far more valuable than any I could have charted for myself. Part 7. The legacy. The memory of Silas's quiet wisdom, his gentle correction, lingered. It wasn't a lesson learned in a classroom or a piece of advice from a mentor. It was an experience, a visceral understanding etched into my being. I began to see the world not as a series of tasks to be completed or obstacles to be overcome, but as a tapestry woven with individual stories, each one deserving of attention, of empathy. My own journey, once so narrowly defined by my own ambitions, began to broaden, encompassing a newfound appreciation for the quiet strength and inherent dignity of others. The engine of my life, once running on impatience and self-importance, now purred with a deeper, more resonant purpose. The world is full of broken things, waiting for a gentle hand. The weight of that realization settled in my chest, a quiet but persistent pressure. It wasn't just about Silas anymore. It was about the countless silent interactions I'd navigated through my life, the ones where my own internal narrative had dictated my perception. Consider how this applies when you encounter the overwhelmed barista, the harried grocery store clerk, or the seemingly indifferent customer service representative. Previously, my instinct might have been to mirror their perceived frustration, to become another ripple in their turbulent day. Now, however, I found myself pausing, taking a breath, and actively seeking a point of connection. It wasn't about performing an act of service, but about acknowledging a shared humanity. I'd start with a simple observation, a comment on the weather, or a genuine compliment on their efficiency, even if it was masked by a grim expression. These weren't grand gestures, they were small, deliberate acts of recognition, designed to pierce through the anonymity that often defined these fleeting encounters. Furthermore, this newfound perspective extended beyond mere politeness. It began to inform how I approached challenges in my own professional life. Instead of immediately labeling a colleague's perceived slowness as incompetence or a lack of commitment, I started to wonder about the unseen pressures they might be under. Was there a personal crisis unfolding? Were they grappling with an overwhelming workload that I, in my own self-absorption, had failed to notice? This shift in perspective didn't excuse poor performance, but it fundamentally altered my response. Instead of frustration, there was a nascent curiosity, a willingness to understand the underlying causes before forming a judgment. Consequently, my interactions became less about assigning blame and more about collaborative problem-solving, fostering an environment where mistakes were seen not as failures, but as opportunities for collective learning and support. Building on this, however, I noticed a subtle but significant change in my own emotional landscape. The constant undercurrent of judgment, the perpetual state of evaluation, had been exhausting. Releasing that burden, choosing empathy over assumption, felt like shedding a heavy cloak. It was liberating. Now, when faced with a situation that might have previously triggered my impatience, I found myself responding with a calmer, more measured approach. This wasn't about becoming a saint. It was about recognizing that my own internal state was intrinsically linked to how I perceived and interacted with the external world. The ripple effect was undeniable. A calmer, more empathetic me was less likely to provoke defensive reactions, thus creating a more positive feedback loop in my interactions. Conversely, the temptation to revert to old habits remained. There were days when the sheer volume of daily demands threatened to pull me back into the familiar cycle of frustration and quick judgment. It was during these moments that I would consciously recall the feeling of Silas's quiet presence, the gentle understanding in his eyes. It served as a powerful anchor, reminding me of the profound impact of a single, unexpected moment of genuine human connection. This wasn't about perfection. It was about persistent effort, about choosing the more challenging but ultimately more rewarding path of empathy, even when it felt easier to retreat into my own familiar defenses. The application of this principle became a daily practice, a continuous refinement of my ability to see beyond the surface, to recognize the unspoken narratives that shaped the experiences of everyone I encountered. The profound realization that Silas's quiet act of repair had initiated a deeper mending within me began to manifest in subtle yet significant shifts in my daily interactions. It wasn't merely about offering pleasantries, it was about a fundamental recalibration of my internal compass, a conscious redirection away from my previous default of swift, often critical assessment. Now, consider how this applies when you encounter unexpected delays in your own day. Instead of the immediate surge of irritation that once characterized my response to a delayed train or a perpetually busy customer service line, I found myself taking a breath. I began to observe the people around me, the shared experience of waiting. I noticed the subtle cues, a weary sigh from a fellow passenger, a strained smile from the attendant. that suggested a narrative far more complex than a simple inconvenience. This conscious pause, this deliberate shift in focus from my own timetable to the shared human experience of the moment, began to dissolve the sharp edges of my impatience. Building on this internal recalibration, I started to actively seek out opportunities to extend that same grace to others in more structured environments. In professional settings, where deadlines and performance metrics often foster a climate of intense pressure and implicit judgment, I found myself actively questioning my initial reactions to perceived shortcomings. For instance, when a project timeline slipped due to a colleague's unexpected absence, my old self would have immediately flagged it as a failure, a lack of preparedness. The new me, however, prompted by the echo of Silas's understanding, began to consider the unseen factors. Was there a family emergency? Had they been overloaded with responsibilities that I, perhaps, had overlooked in my focus on my own deliverables? This didn't mean excusing the delay, but it reframed the problem from one of personal failing to one of systemic challenge or unforeseen circumstance, opening the door for a more constructive, supportive approach to finding a solution. Consequently, the tenor of my professional relationships began to evolve. Where once there might have been a subtle undercurrent of competition or guardedness, a more collaborative spirit started to emerge. By consciously choosing to extend the benefit of the doubt, by actively trying to understand the context behind an individual's actions, I found that others were more receptive to my own contributions and concerns. It fostered an environment where vulnerability was less of a liability and more of a shared human experience, creating a stronger, more resilient team dynamic. This wasn't about adopting a passive, uncritical stance. Rather, it was about cultivating a more nuanced understanding, recognizing that behind every action there is a story, often one that extends far beyond the immediate situation. Conversely, the internal work required to maintain this shift was not without its challenges. The ingrained habit of swift judgment, honed over years of what I had mistakenly believed was efficient problem-solving, would often resurface, particularly during moments of acute stress. In those instances, the temptation to revert to a more critical, less empathetic stance was strong. It was during these junctures that the memory of Silas's quiet hands, his steady gaze, became a vital touchstone. It served as a potent reminder that true efficiency wasn't about simply clearing obstacles, but about navigating them with a deeper understanding of the human element involved. This ongoing internal dialogue, this conscious effort to choose empathy over assumption, became a continuous process of self-refinement, much like the careful tuning of an engine. Another crucial layer to this developing perspective involved recognizing that the act of offering understanding was not a finite resource to be depleted, but rather a generative force. The more I practiced extending grace, the more readily it seemed to flow, not just towards others, but also towards myself. The harsh self-criticism that had often accompanied my own perceived missteps began to soften. I started to view my own moments of imperfection not as definitive failures, but as opportunities for growth, much like Silas viewed a sputtering engine not as a lost cause, but as a machine needing careful attention. This self-compassion, born from the very empathy I was learning to extend outwards, created a more balanced and resilient internal state, allowing me to approach life's inevitable challenges with a greater sense of equanimity. The subtle shift in my demeanor began to ripple outwards, touching even the periphery of my professional interactions. It wasn't about grand pronouncements or overt displays of newfound empathy. Rather, it manifested in a more nuanced approach to everyday challenges. For instance, consider how this applies when you're navigating a collaborative project where differing opinions emerge. My previous inclination might have been to immediately champion my own perspective, viewing any disagreement as a roadblock to efficiency. Now, however, I found myself actively soliciting the underlying reasoning behind opposing viewpoints. Instead of simply refuting an idea, I'd probe for the why. This often revealed underlying concerns or priorities that hadn't been initially apparent, transforming a potential conflict into an opportunity for deeper understanding and more robust problem-solving. It was about recognizing that a dissenting voice wasn't necessarily an act of opposition, but potentially a signal of an unaddressed aspect of the issue. The true practice begins now, in the everyday unfolding of life, in the myriad small interactions that, when viewed through a lens of empathy, reveal a deeper, more profound reality. It's in the deliberate choice to see the individual behind the role, the story behind the action, the struggle behind the facade. It's in the quiet understanding that every person, like my car that night, might just need a moment to breathe, to be heard, to be seen. The engine of my own life, once driven by a relentless, self-centered urgency, now purrs with a different kind of power, fueled by a growing capacity for compassion and a quiet appreciation for the intricate, often unseen, mechanics of the human heart.